Today and for the next few days we're going to be reading the book of Job. Job's probably dated as the earliest of the books of the Bible, and its story is well known in all of the civilizations around the world at that time. But Job has a couple of really important things for us. It talks about the different ways that we see God and how we interpret things and how we interpret our understanding of Him into everything we do. And we also begin to see the different dimensions of an earthly kingdom and a heavenly kingdom. Satan appears in the very beginning of the book, and actually this is only one of the 3 times in the entire of the Old Testament that Satan is mentioned. But what we realise there is that all the things that happened to Job, Satan is only allowed to do those at God's permission. And if we are in a position of righteousness that we have through Jesus Christ, the enemy is only allowed access to us under the permission of our loving Heavenly Father. It seems like the book of Job is a bit like a boxing match where Job goes 3 rounds with each of these supposed comforters. But actually there's something really important as we read of these men. There's a theme that goes through it, because each of these men have the truth. But unfortunately they don't have the whole truth and nothing but the truth. They have a view of God, and they put everything through the lens of that single view. And this causes them to totally miss the point, and to bring a life and a line about who God is and what He is, that although true in that respect, does not contain the fullness of who God is. And today we mention Eliphaz. And this man is obviously religious, he's obviously a theologian, and he comes at Job and tells him that God is everywhere and knows everything and sees everything and is in charge of everything. He's a mighty God, but actually he's probably too busy for you. And so he simply puts it to that if the wicked are wicked, they'll be punished. If the good are good, they'll be blessed. And he takes this position, and that through his experience and that through his understanding is who God is. But he has no personal knowledge of a Saviour and Deliverer, a Redeemer and a friend. As we continue our journey through Job, we come to another one of his comforters, Bildad. And Bildad's position is that he is a traditionalist, he is a religious traditionalist. God has done this and it will always be the same. God is all powerful, and when someone sins, he will be judged. And therefore, if you're being judged, you must have sinned. The problem is that, like with Eliphaz, Bildad's coming from a single point of view. He's looking at this situation through a single lens of who God is. And therefore he's brought his tradition and his religion into the situation, and he's fixed it, and he cannot comprehend a God who is bigger than his box. How often we read verses and say, this is a verse from the Bible, therefore it must be true, and claim it. But actually sometimes we need to be looking and saying, what is God saying? Is this what God is saying? It's amazing how many times we do quote from the 3 comforters who come to him at first and say, this is in the Bible, therefore it must be true. It is true, but it may not be the whole truth, and it may not be nothing but the truth. We finished off yesterday's reading with the third of Job's comforters, Zophar, beginning to speak to him. And Zophar's position was very simple. God knows everything. He's moral. It's simple. If there's sin, there will be punishment. And if there's punishment, there must be sin. You might not know you've sinned, but you have sinned because God is like that. And so Zophar has these moral, dogmatic positions, and he tries to fit everything that's going on into the framework of his faith. You know, I think sometimes we can do that. And today, as we read, Job begins to respond to this. And he says, where have I sinned? How have I sinned? And this is where Job himself begins to slip, because he's beginning to justify himself instead of turning to the Lord. Today we're in the second round of the approaches by the comforters. They've given their stories on the first round, they've put their point of view, and actually Job has not fallen for what they're saying. He's not just bowed under it and said, oh, I'm wicked, I'm wicked, I'm wicked. And they just come back a little bit harder, a little bit firmer. And Job finds himself deflated. He's looking around and saying, I've lost everything, and now even relationships have been broken. I can't even walk down the street without people making a fun of me. How hard it must have been for him. And he begins to be concerned and begins to be even calling for death and calling for the grave. He's wondering why God has done this to him. He never does know what's happened in heaven. But what else has happened there is that the comforters are getting harder and harder and harder. And I don't know about you, but perhaps all of us do it, that when we think we know we're right and someone hasn't responded, we find ourselves not comforting but crushing by becoming harder and harder and harder. Job was at a very low ebb yesterday. His heart was absolutely crushed and he was crying out for the grave. It didn't help his comforters at all. They just poured in even more heavy stuff and hard stuff and tried to grinding him into the dirt. But something happened with Job. He began to see through, very clearly through the accusations that were coming. He knew that they were not founded, but he also recognized that they were the way that he himself might think. He began to see the truth. And he declared, I know that my Redeemer lives. He knew that he had someone who would stand in the gap for him. He knew that there was a promise of a judgment where the righteous would be judged fairly and the wicked would be punished. But he also knew that that was a future, a promise that would never be missed out on. There was no way of escaping that judgment, no way of getting around it. But it was not of this life. And it may be that the wicked prosper, the wicked do well for themselves, and the righteous struggle. But they would not escape the promises and the judgments of God. Today we're into the last round of the battles that Job has with his comforters. They make their last accusations, really, as I said before, just getting harder and harder with what they're saying. But we see Job responding, and it's a fascinating response today. We see him responding, looking at the law, and actually, we're talking about a time before law was given. And yet we could almost be reading in Deuteronomy as we're going through the law, as he states clearly what God expects and what God does not want. He's also very clear about how the wicked will be punished. He begins to see more and more clearly that there is a time of judgment coming. It's not just a might be or a maybe, but he's seeing it so clearly. And there's something very amazing about Job, and this is a good time to mention it. In Ezekiel chapter 14, Ezekiel speaks about if God was going to judge the world, then only 3 people would have any hope of surviving on their own righteousness. One was Noah, one was Job, and the other was Daniel. Even though Job is going through it, he is absolutely seen as a man who was walking as righteously as he possibly could. Except, of course, he's begun to get proud, and he needs to see that his only hope is in the Lord himself. Yesterday we noted that Job was speaking as though he knew the book of Deuteronomy, even though it wasn't even written. Today you might say the same of him knowing the book of Proverbs. He begins to speak about wisdom, and that God's wisdom is so precious that it needs to be searched for, it needs to be run after. He speaks about the way that mankind has learned how to dig into the earth. Fascinatingly, a few years ago, Sharon and I were down in Cornwall, and we were at a tin mine. And we went through all the processes and seeing how it was done. And that night, Sharon was reading this chapter in chapter 28 in Job, and she said, you know, the very processes that we saw that day were the processes that were seen. And Job is saying, man knows how to get the most precious things out of the earth. How much more important it is to get the wisdom of God. God is wise, and wise beyond our understanding. And it's so exciting to be able to recognize that Job was first of all becoming to see just how wise God is. But unfortunately at the same time, his heart is becoming proud and hurt and self-righteous because he knows he hasn't done anything wrong. It's worth noting that today as well that Job is the most amazing set of poetry possibly ever written. It starts off with a bit of prose and finishes with a bit of prose, but in the middle we have this piece of poetry. And in the way it describes it, we have these arguments, and these men are represented not just as men, but represented in their thinking, that speak not just for 4,000 years ago, but speak to us today. People have not changed. There is nothing new under the sun. But God is sovereign. Today as we read, we continue Job's rebuttal of the arguments that has been brought against him by his 3 comforters. These comforters have come and they've said, surely God punishes the wicked. If you're being punished, you must be wicked. They've come at it from 3 different approaches. They've come and said that God is above everything and is just in charge of everything. God is all-powerful and God is all-knowing. They've recognized who God is in certain aspects and have put everything through those lenses. And Job has successfully come against this and said, but there's more. This does not answer the question as to why am I being punished, for I've not done any of the things that you've said. Now, Job is becoming a little self-righteous in that, and this will become an issue. But in the middle of this, he's there. And he's also recognizing that his own view of God is misaligned. And whenever our view of God is misaligned, we'll find ourselves slipping into self-pity and into depression. But Job, who has previously looked at the law as if reading Deuteronomy, has looked at Proverbs as though reading out of Proverbs, he goes through almost line by line the Sermon on the Mount. He looks at each one and says, actually, I haven't done this, I haven't done that, I haven't done that. It's amazing that he comes to this conclusion. I'm still righteous. Why am I suffering? Here is the question that is bugging Job all the way through. I am suffering and I don't know why. And perhaps we're going to see tomorrow the opening of these answers. Today Job's words are ended and another speaker steps up, a man called Elihu. It says that he's a young man. He says, I've waited for all you wise people to stop, and he speaks up. Now this is really interesting because Elihu is going to speak for 6 chapters, and at the end of it Job does not reply. God steps in at that point, and we'll see that in a couple of days' time. But as we study Elihu, we find ourselves challenged with something that's pretty significant. As we're reading Elihu, we start seeing that the same arguments that the 3 comforters have put forward, he also put forward. And some people come and say, well, Elihu is just recapping it. And actually he's doing it more violently and he's doing it more aggressively, and really this could be just a position of youth, a position of arrogance. But actually, as we look at it, we might see another point of view. Elihu speaks for these 6 chapters, and Job has no answer to Elihu. He managed, through these 3 comforters, to completely put down their arguments. I think as we look at Elihu, we may find something a little bit different. And I hope tomorrow we'll start seeing something that is going to be more helpful. Yesterday and today's passages are the full discourse of Elihu. We asked yesterday whether Elihu was just another angry man, or whether he was bringing something new to the table. The answer, I believe, that he was bringing something very new. He dismissed the arguments of the 3 comforters because they were basically wrong. Not totally wrong in that they were inaccurate, but that they only had one lens that they were looking through. He also criticized Job for his self-righteousness and trying to justify himself rather than justifying God. And then Elihu goes and puts together this discourse, when in it we hear him repeating some of the things that the 3 comforters have said, but he says the same as all 3 of them. But he adds another aspect to it. He adds that actually that it's God's love and his mercy that's in action. That sometimes that someone is just suffering because there is punishment. It's because they've done something wrong, that there are consequences to our sin. But other times we see that it's God's love and his hand upon us. And then he speaks about if there a special messenger from heaven comes and pleads our case, then God will lift our punishment. He makes an amazing illusion. Here, at the very beginning of time, there is a declaration that Jesus is able to save us from our sin. We've read 37 chapters now of Job. The question has been all the way through, why do the righteous suffer? And at last God stands up and begins to bring his discourse, bringing his answer to it. And do you know what? He never answers the question. He never says this is it. But what he does say is who he is. That he controls everything. That in his hand are the sky, the stars, the weather, the thunder, the lightning, the volcanoes, the oceans, and every animal that lives in it. He describes himself and speaks and says, Who do you think you are even to come against me? Who do you think you are? Can you answer the questions about what I've done? And Job just turns to him, puts his hand over his mouth and said, what have I been saying? Yesterday we left Job with his hand across his mouth, realizing the foolishness of what he'd been saying, that he tried to justify himself in front of God. And here we see the Lord speaking to him in power and majesty and authority. We've seen him speaking about his greatness and his power over every element there is over the universe. And today he begins to speak about his authority and just questioning Job as to whether or not he can do what God can do. He talks about the crocodile and the hippopotamus and just seeing how great God is. And Job turns and begins to see his foolishness and repents. And the moment he repents, we find that God forgives him. And what's more, God restores him to his health. And then the Lord turns to the three comforters. Interesting, I think, that it's the three comforters and not four. That Elihu is not included in them. And he says, you have misrepresented me. You know, sometimes we misrepresent God. We say things about him that are partly true, but not fully true. He is a God of justice and righteousness. He is a God of power and authority. But he is a God of love and mercy and grace. And here we see his grace being extended. And he tells Job's friends, go, bring a sacrifice and let Job bless you. And as Job does that, all the things that have been lost are restored, and more. And it just gives a beautiful end to the story. But the question about why do the righteous suffer is never really answered. But we see something more about it if we turn to the New Testament in 1 Peter 1, 6 and 7. So be truly glad. There is a wonderful joy ahead. Even though you must endure many trials for a little while, these trials will show that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold. Though your faith is far more precious than mere gold, so your faith remains strong, and through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honour in the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11 and 12. For our earthly fathers disciplined us for many years, doing the best they knew how. But God's discipline is always good for us, so that we might share in his holiness. No discipline is enjoyable while it's happening. It's painful, but afterwards there will be a peaceful harvest of right living for those who are trained in this way. So take a new grip of your tired hands and strengthen your weak knees. And James chapter 1 verses 2 and 3 and 4. Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity of great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow, and when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete and needing nothing. That's the end of Job. Let's begin Exodus tomorrow.